Hello, everyone, and welcome to the beginning of week 13 for exercise physiology, kinesiology 406, with now the beginning of 4 weeks left in as far as a regular class goes. And then we have what's essentially a finals type week, which of course will be from a distance, but that'll be the time to kind of finalize everything and put everything together for what is the equivalency of your final exam, which of course will be the final project. And I will talk more about that. That being said, I want to say first and foremost, I was very impressed with the last couple weeks. It was hard not to give top-notch grades to the large majority of you, and everybody, I think pretty much everybody, improved the last couple weeks, maybe because you have a little more time at home, maybe because the content resonated with you more. I'd like to think that you're just getting the content better and starting to improve more. Who knows? Regardless, if you keep that up, things are going to go very, very well over the last few weeks. Maybe it's starting to just kind of get used to the concepts and used to being at home. Again, I can probably go on all day trying to figure out exactly what it is. All I know is I was very impressed by that, and I thought that was a very good sign for all of you for finishing out the rest of the semester. That being said, your grades are now up. You do have basically about 55-ish, 54, 55% of your grade accumulated at this point. Then you've got that research paper, you've got the final project, one more exam, a few discussion board posts, one of which the discussion board post last week 12, will be part of that soon. And then, of course, you have the participation grade, which is really going to be based upon what's really going to come down to the participation grade. What I can recall from you when you were in class, how you played a role, you were paying attention, you were involved, you asked questions when necessary, and, of course, your discussion board posts, you're interacting with people. Your discussion, technically, it's participation is supposed to be discussion involved with others. So I will also look back at the last few weeks in particular, look at your responses to each other and showing the efforts you're making in that regard to determine on a scale of 1 to 10 where you are. And don't worry, no one's going to get a 1. You've been coming to class, you've been doing the work. Bare minimum, you're looking at a 7 at a 10 there, and you're looking at an 8 or above if you're doing a pretty darn good job, and 9 or a 10 if I can't ask for much more from you. So that's kind of what you're looking at in that regard. And of course, I will look back as we get into that final week and I determine your final grades. I will also look back at these last few weeks as that's how you finish, right? How you improve, how much better you get over the course of a semester makes all the difference in the world for those determinations of a plus or minus 2% either direction with your scores for your final grade. There's a definite possibility of that as we look at the basically the subjective factors of the efforts you've made, and the objective results you've given over the final few weeks. Okay. And that said, I will talk more about your final discussion board posts, your research paper, and your project here shortly as well. Okay. Key concepts from last week and beyond. Some of you actually mentioned it for this time about children and training up children. There's a concept that's been going on for a while that kind of was big for a while and it died off as far as the promotion of it. But this concept of Play 60 for children. And of course, what makes me think about whenever I saw those commercials and the promotions for it, I think it's fantastic. I mean, it's such a great idea, and seeing all these professional athletes on board with the encouragement of children to be playing for 60 minutes or more a day, 60 minutes or more. And of course, my first thought, first time I saw it was, why is that not a common theme for adults too? Certainly it's huge for the children and adolescents for their growth and well-being as a whole, for their maturation, from the standpoint of higher levels of maturation, better bone growth, higher stroke volumes, higher glycolytic capacity, greater muscle mass, lower fat mass compared to total mass, going on and on. Fantastic things. Of course, myelination from the standpoint of faster conduction of nerve impulses. So that's what really works towards greater levels of coordination and skill, so that neural responses for strength gains, so to speak, or skill type gains are much higher as in later years, and other sports and other activities can be taken on a much greater degree. All that's good. It's fantastic. The question is, of course, why don't we do it for all adults too? We try to almost, I've always been concerned about this. It's almost like we dumb it down, saying things like 150 minutes of per week, which is fine. It's not wrong. It's accurate. That's a bare minimum, but we really should be saying like, yeah, but you should be getting in not just 50 minutes of moderate exercise or 75 minutes of vigorous exercise per week. That's the bare minimum, right? Play 60 is really supposed to be the bare minimum. That's essentially 300 minutes or 360 minutes. No, I'm sorry, 420 minutes, right? That's 420 minutes. We're talking about 150 for adults. or 75. Really, right? Like, come on now. That's such a huge downturn. Now, a lot of that's because of the expectation of the stress upon adults for how much you're asking of them to go from 0 to 420 or more. But of course, what we really expect from a top tier athlete is not just 420, but try doubling that, or at least 1.5. To be perfectly clear, the expectation for elite athletes is for being elite, the bare minimum per day average is 90 minutes a day. Now, again, that's not specific towards necessarily like learning plays in a sport or some aspect of strategy involved there, but more specifically towards anything that improves physiological capacity or performance capacity or performance improvement. All those things. That's 90 minutes. That physical component alone. That's a lot. And even athletes don't necessarily get that. But that's the average for expectation to be in those higher levels of performance. And the expectation to be, I want to be fit, I want to be healthy the rest of my life. Not just healthy, but fit, strong, good cardiovascular capacity, as much as can be expected as you age and get older. It's 60 minutes a day, go figure, just like the Play 60. There's a lot of research to support that by the National Institute of Health. If you look deeper and deeper, you got to find it. It's harder to find. There was some studies done in 2005 that have kind of gotten, I don't know what happened to them. They've gotten buried. I can't even find them anymore. I saved them somewhere in some hard drive back when we didn't have the capacity to save to the cloud, and I had to find it somewhere. But it was there, and it was actually talking about the hour and a half versus hour per day down to the minimum, which is 30 minutes a day, which comes out to basically 210 plus minutes of exercise per week just to be healthy, which is significantly more than the numbers we hear now. I think theoretically, and I can't prove this, that there's a lot of backlash or stress coming off a lot of people, both at higher levels doing the research, knowing that people would respond negatively, that they couldn't keep up with that. So we got to make it lighter. Let's go minimums. Let's not try to go absolute things we'd like you to have. Let's go minimums. I think is what happened. That's just my theory. So don't quote me on that, but I think it's probably the case. I'd like to see it be higher for adults too. And Play 60 really should be really a minimum for children. Really, really should for exercise. And we didn't talk about a lot, but certainly from a standpoint of performance goes, children should be playing, enjoying, learning about games, not trying to win at games, even though, sure, we can have competitions, but it's not the end-all be-all if we win. It's when they say it's how you played the game. It's really how you played, not so much as just from a sportsmanship standpoint and being out there playing, having fun, but more specifically playing hard, doing the best you can, growing and improving, seeking to grow and improve, continue to, yes, overload, right, even as a child, but not so much to win per se, which is where things really get sketchy for children and adolescents in terms of their detriment to their performance gains, as well as injuries and future illnesses and problems, and really loss of interest in playing sports and playing competitions because they are taught, some cases, to win too early when they need to be learning and growing and improving. Some more thoughts there. So one of the questions actually that should be coming up is, and your book mentions it, how vital is the factor of body mass with performance testing when doing VO2 max or doing maximal strength, taking into account body mass, being that technically with body mass, certainly with a standpoint of maximal strength, you're going to see some improvement there. From a standpoint of mass, your higher mass is going to allow you to typically, expectedly, to move greater loads. Not always true, but typically on average. That said, if you have two people, male or female, easier to measure within the same gender, but really can measure across a body of population. You have people that probably weigh 150 pounds or less, and you have maybe the 230, 240 and up category. The bigger people versus people who are typically not as much size. Neither here nor there with that. Just is what it is. That being the case, if we have someone who's say 240. And their VO2 max is 48, 49, 50. Then you have someone who's 140 and their VO2 max is 48, 49, 50 VO2 max, right? Then we're looking at the person who's 140 pounds with that VO2 max going to be just destroying in a performance perspective the 240-pound person with the same VO2 max because they don't have so much more mass to move. They got 100 pounds more mass to move. That's insane. It's like taking whatever you are right now and adding, well, if you go from 140 to 240, you're looking at really more than 2/3 of body mass. So add more than 2/3 of your body mass on top of you and go for a run and see how that goes, right? that's a whole different ball of wax there. So that's why body mass plays a role. However, when a bigger factor, it's less consistent with what you expect for performance. It's more taken into account, like you can see why performance would be different. And it's more to understand from a health perspective. If you have a 240-pound person with a 48 VO2 max or better, I gotta say, that's fantastic. For a 240-pound person to have a VO2 max around 50 or better, that's phenomenal. That's really unusual to find that. It exists, but it's really unusual. As well, you'd expect to see someone much, much lighter, hoping to have a much higher VO2 max, although you see that sometimes too, and that's not good. What's the most important training factor to focus on for ensuring proper performance? I asked you this question generally, and I've asked you in previous weeks too, if you probably recall, because I want to keep harping on it. We've talked about it so many times, the difference of neural strength gains, the difference of myelination of nerve fibers, greater conductivity of neural impulses to communicate with the nervous system to the muscular system, so that ultimately what you have is greater skill, greater improvement capacity for performance, basically skill development over time. What performance checks should you do with every set to ensure proper performance? Heart rate and RPE, unquestionably. We should always be looking at actual force output. How fast did they go? How much did they lift? How long can they go before fatigue? How much rest did they have and were able to do it again? Those are normal performance checks we should always be doing and recording so we have the data. Also taking heart rate within 6 seconds after you finish. Taking it right away, within 10 seconds they say, but start it as soon as possible, preferably at the radial artery. The carotid artery is not as accurate. Typically people can put too much pressure there, and when putting the pressure there, they get not an accurate result. They actually can't tell properly, and the radial artery seems to have a better response. You can get expensive equipment to wear, but you really got to wear a heart rate transmitter across your chest to really get accurate numbers. There's really not a lot of research yet to really support whether some of the wearing your Apple Watch and other forms of equipment that don't have, they're trying to measure it at the wrist, but it doesn't have the same contact point or same basically how tight it is to your skin to be able to get closeness to the heart, all those things. There's not a lot of research to support it yet, but I speculate from what I've seen, you're going to see some variability by a few percent or more easily at higher levels of performance due to higher differences in variability of heart rate as well as heart rates as a whole. So you're better off doing it both manually and your little piece of equipment, unless you have a chest transmitter around your chest to kind of confirm the results. Take it for 6 seconds, not taking it for 60 seconds after a set, because heart rate's going to be dropping during that time. It's not going to give an accurate indicator of the intensity in which you just had. So that's why, and you're going to see a higher heart rate, interestingly, in a few seconds after exercise finishes. Right? Your body's trying to cope with the fact that not only has it been increasing stress up to the point you stopped, but also the fact that you are essentially trying to recover now, and your body's trying to work hard to get into recovery. So you see a heart rate rise, and there is the fact that heart rate monitor is giving you a number it's reading from a few seconds in the last few seconds and kind of extrapolating it. It's not exactly exact in that moment picking it up. It takes a little bit of translation there. There's been improvement in that, but there's some of that involved in there as well. But heart rate every single time. Rate of perceived exertion is something you should take too. So you're basically looking at how you feel on a scale 1 to 10. And of course, that's not indicative of your exact response. That's not the point. The point is to see subjectively how you're feeling to determine if the intensity is appropriate, to see if you're going to be fatiguing. You'd expect with each set, the RP would be going up. You'd be seeing higher and higher increases with each set. But that said, that's going to be an indicator of understanding someone's performance. So if their RPE goes up, but the performance goes down, then we don't want to see that RPE right now. So we got to lower their perception of effort by giving them actual less objective performance expectation so they can actually recover properly. So we have to adjust. If they're having an effort level that's higher than normal compared to performance that's the same or lesser than normal, we have to adjust by increasing rest or decreasing work periods or decreasing work intensities, whatever might be the case. And our primary parameters of work intensity are our force output, sometimes referred to as pace, our heart rate, our RPE, and blood lactate. And we can't necessarily measure blood lactate unless we actually can take blood from someone. So there's always that limitation. That would be ideal. Take blood every 30 seconds or less to constantly know how someone's doing and be able to read it on a regular basis. That's just not something you can really do, but that would be the ideal. So it's heart rate and RPE after every single set, and of course performance expectations of we're measuring actual performances. And you're going to see over time by looking at these this data. And if you're a coach, this is an easy one. You got to be doing it, or you have an aide or an assistant coach or someone else recording the data for you. Everybody can self-report, and actually everybody go to the person with the clipboard, or a couple people with clipboards. If you got like 20, 30, 40, 50 athletes, getting data all the time. And most coaches don't do that, and they wonder why there's so much variation in how people perform. Like, well, you can take some really important data every single day. I heard a great presentation years ago from a gentleman named Mark Verstegen, who is a former strength coach in the NFL, and does a lot of work now in his own business and his own institutions, where he brings on coaches and trainers and whatnot to help athletes and people who want to be like athletes. And one of the best things he ever he said that he ever learned, and one of the best presentations I've heard, is talking about how we've got to record more data. We've got to get more information. The more information you get, that you track, that you follow, that you utilize, the better your coaching, your training, your developing is going to be. And that's why heart rate and RPE should be taken all the time. They are not, and you as a coach or a trainer or teacher or just a self-trained athlete, doing that is going to put you at a level above others in your development or the people you're trying to develop. And of course, again, movement skill is the key factor with when you get more flexible, which is really the ability to achieve a full range of motion at a given joint. If we have total body flexibility, you can move through a full range of motion anywhere, so to speak, if you have total flexibility. Someone's incredibly flexible as a whole. Some of that's genetic, some of that is trained. And of course, you have to work at it to really see that training, and ideally, like always, be doing it earlier in life, preferably to see the maximal flexibility, because it affects the formation of bone. So when someone does gymnastics early, or any form of activity that requires a lot of range of motion and a lot of control into deep ranges of motion, it can make that athlete or that kid, as a later time, be much more flexible throughout their life, because they've actually had a difference in changes to formation of the bone. But because of that, we have to be really careful. There's been stories in the past, you don't see much of it anymore, at least I certainly hope not, in some martial arts perspectives and some gymnastics, whereby people are forcing other people try to get more range of motion, like pushing them, to the point where they can tear a connective tissue and malform bones. That's not a good thing. That's not the goal. But doing things early to work on greater flexibility, just like anything else with strength, muscle mass, glycolytic capacity, VO2 max, all those things help. But mobility is not just the ability to achieve a full range of motion at a joint, but more specifically to have control within ranges of motion, control in general, coordination, control, mobile, not just coordination from a standpoint of a particular activity, but mobility is through full ranges of motion and coordinated type actions. That's a phenomenal thing. From a football perspective, I'll never forget watching Barry Sanders, who to me is one of the most incredible athletes I've ever seen on a football field from a standpoint of mobility. The guy would bounce around and move in directions that people didn't think were possible. That kind of thing is somewhat, of course, genetic. But the more we work on it at an early age, the better off we're going to be. And that should be a predominant focus, more so than strength from a general perspective. Doesn't mean always the case. It depends on their training year, training focus and goal. But that's monstrous, especially for longevity. Flexibility and mobility are more important than total muscle mass for longevity, as far as performance long term. Doesn't mean we don't need to have it. Muscle mass too. That's just secondary. That's all. And of course, that's how we're talking about where we're getting efficiency and effectiveness. You're more efficient, meaning less wasted effort when you have greater levels of skill. Right? You're more effective, meaning greater results when you have higher levels of skill. Then, of course, force output, as we mentioned, which on outside running around, it's your speed. How fast you get somewhere, or how much distance you can cover in a given time. Or how fast you can throw, how quickly you can release a ball, or how quickly you can change in a given direction, agility-wise, all those things, right? All aspects of force output. In a strength perspective, tempo as well. Sometimes slowing down, you're better off. In a golf swing, if you're incredibly precise, a faster speed will get you much more power and much more distance off the tee. That being said, sometimes slowing the speed of the swing down, having greater control, allowing more flexibility, a little more mobility and control there, can actually get you better result. So there's always the variations there as well. That said, how do we ensure proper bone density? Several of you mentioned, and you're absolutely right, that calcium plays a major role. Absolutely. Mineral content, bone mineral density, plays a monstrous role in the standpoint of bone density. However, that is not the predominant way bone grows. Bone grows, as your book mentions, from weight-bearing activities. But to be clear, someone doing an arm curl, and I think I mentioned this before, but arm curl, the standpoint of the arm, the dumbbell in your hand or cable in your cable handle in your hand there as you lift that load is not going to get you much of anything from a standpoint of bone density through your arm because you're not really getting compressive forces. However, with that weight in your hand, especially like dumbbells, you got weights in your hands that are kind of, your body's being pushed down to some extent, but whatever weight is in your hand. So you've got compressive forces on your spine and your legs, a little bit in your legs, but really on your spine in particular. So if you keep that spine rigid and that torso rigid, under control, not moving around when you do things, not only is that important for control as a whole and getting benefit from exercise, no wasted effort, having skill and control of and mobility in terms of moving under load. That said, your greater bone density is going to be there as well, trying to keep that spine stabilized while you're lifting that load and arm curl. But generally speaking, we talk about compressive force activities to be more specific than just weight bearing. Being some compression is created there for the spine and the legs in an arm curl, but an overhead press, pressing weight over your head would be compressive forces down through your arms, spine, legs, everything. And some people even go so far as doing something like an overhead press, squat press. You got to be careful. This is where people get kind of carried away sometimes. Yes, now you're actually incorporating leg motion and upper body motion and compressive force activities, so you're going to potentially get benefits to bone density, not just strength, of connective tissue as well, potentially for upper body, core, so to speak, spine, and lower body. But more specifically, though, you're putting so much of a coordinated challenge onto a person that if skill is not present there and they don't move fluidly, and I always tell people when they're lifting with load and with exercise in general, if it doesn't look nice, so nice that when someone would stop and go, wow, who is that? Where did they learn to do that? How do they move so well? If you don't get that, then you shouldn't be looking to move your weight up. You shouldn't be looking to go faster. You shouldn't be looking to do those things if you don't have the capacity to control motion. What is control? Something that most people can agree on. You look at it and you go, that looks nice. Not just, wow, he's lifting a lot of weight. Or, wow, she moves really fast. Under control or just spastically, right? Or with load, like with all over the place, or just really fluid and smooth. If that's the case, we start talking about benefit to a greater extent with control. And I say, remember, astronauts, that when their astronauts are in space, they eat healthy. They're not eating ice cream. Well, they might. Who knows what they take up there? They take dessert and stuff too. But they eat really, really well. And they're incredibly fit people to be an astronaut. They don't want to let you go in space unless you're incredibly fit before you go. Cardiovascularly, small people, typically speaking, because they don't want to be being challenged by high body masses and the effects upon someone in space. It's better off they're lighter people, generally speaking. But that said, that's just a lot going on with that. But in space, after a few days, let alone a couple, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, month, the tremendous loss of bone mass, connective tissue strength, connective tissue density, muscle mass, all of those things is dramatic, despite the fact they eat well, because it's the compressive force activity that they need. And that's the thing that ultimately can really hurt people long term if they don't get proper compressive force activities. And why, whenever someone asks me, what exercise should I do? First thing out of my mouth, I should say, as I say, do you walk? And I'm talking about someone who's older, probably not a child, I hope. But do you walk? What do you mean, do I walk? Of course I walk. No, do you go for walks? And walks at faster paces for long periods. Then we talk about running and good jumping and so on and so forth. Always starting there, unless they say they love their elliptical or their bike, whatnot, then okay, we can go there. But you got to have compressive force activities. How do we best ensure connective tissue strengthening? Well, I'm going to ask you this question, of course, in your post as well, and that comes from higher forces on any given joint, okay? Means force you can handle and control, not just, let's just add a bunch of load, right? Or add a bunch of tremendous opposing resistance or opposing force to challenge you, or have you go super fast. Actually, it's supposed to be slow. Supposed to be slower at higher loads. Okay, if you want to improve connective tissue strength, it's supposed to be high load really, but effectively meaning high force to move higher loads, so to speak, and slower tempos or lower speeds. Okay, and I may have alluded to it before. If you're going to be training athletes, you need to buy a book called Super Training by Yuri Verkhoshansky, who's a guy who basically came up with plyometrics, and Mel Siff. The two of them have written a book like none I've ever seen, flat out, for training of athletes. It's phenomenal. It's like, and if you ask me from a standpoint of the Bible for us as human beings, for the Word of God, right? We're talking about here for training people. I would consider it to be the Bible. Okay, that's your beginning point, or not your beginning point. So why it's not the same? It's because it's really advanced. It's something where everybody should start. It's something where some people should end up. Okay, if the Bible is something you read last as opposed to first, then that's what it would be. Okay, so it's not quite the same analogy, but it's something that's really vital, and I highly recommend that for you longer term. And they talk a lot about that: higher loads, slow speeds for connective tissue strengthening, ligaments, tendons, fascia, but not fast. Fast is more for reactive skill, and it's important being fast at times for life as well as sport, but for connective tissue strengthening, we're talking about slow tempos. And I think I may have said it in class before, I'm always amazed when my shoulder bothers me or elbow bothers me. I was trying to do some pressing activities and whatnot, and I go down to the ground, and thank God I can still do some push-ups. One day it's going to leave me, but I go down, I go super slow, I mean really slow, way too slow to really be looking at being a normal set of push-ups, to the point, I'll go to the point of doing super slow push-ups as much as I can before I start to feel like my form is fatiguing, and then I'll relax for a moment or so, and I'll go back to whatever pressing activities I was doing. My elbow stops feeling funky, my shoulder feels more stable, everything. It's always amazing to me how that works out. Some of that's individual, but slowing things down from a connective tissue standpoint and a coordination standpoint is vital. Aging and length of life. A lot has been said, and your book notes it too, that about activity and helping someone live longer. Well, from a standpoint of activity helping avoid disease, there's a real possibility that it could potentially help you live a longer life by avoiding traumatic illnesses. It does not necessarily mean that because someone's exercising, they're going to live a longer life, because there's so many individual genetic factors, stresses in life that people cope with that are impossible. The reason, one of the biggest things that affects all of us, that you just can't track everything for everyone in every minute detail. And the stress of life is one of the biggest things that is impossible to fully quantify. We try. We should continue to try, but it's hard to do. That being said, the best way to live a long and healthy life is to exercise, and the longer part has to do with actually decreased caloric intake, leading to decreased body mass. Generally speaking, people with less body mass live longer lives. There's plenty of studies, not plenty, there are some studies talking about Pacific Islanders and people in cultures whereby they're generally speaking bigger people. And in some cases, they can live to be 80s, 90s on a regular basis too. So certainly, it by itself, that is not the only thing, but generally speaking, especially in Western culture, the most consistent thing that we have in research to show leading a longer life is less body mass due to less caloric intake, especially, more specifically to relative to activity. We don't want to be eating too much if we're not exerting a lot. If we're exerting a lot, we've got to eat more. Not rocket science, right? But at the same time, that is a very important factor for the longer part of the life. The exercise is more for the quality of the life, if we're not just looking at sport performance or performance in activity. Now, gender differences in sport and training. We're talking about chapter 19 now. We're basically talking about the role of something you don't hear probably a lot of talking about, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. These gonadotropic hormones, they're secreted from the anterior pituitary gland in very small amounts before puberty, which increase substantially as time goes on. Okay, and that said, it stimulates both testosterone and estrogen. For the women, it stimulates more of the certainly a standpoint of ovaries, stimulates, of course, more so estrogen secretion in girls, and then estrogen increases the bone growth rate. Doesn't mean you can have big, stronger bones or longer bones. It increases how fast bones grow. And because of that, though, typically speaking, one of the reasons why women tend to be typically shorter on average than men, typically speaking, grow earlier, is because estrogen increases that bone growth rate at a much earlier time. From what we speculate, what certainly seems to be the case with science, that it's more toward the potential need or ability to have children, childbearing. And so consequently, basically your body's getting ready at an earlier time as far as growing bone, growing connective tissue, hormonal balance, height, all those things, length of bone, growth density of bone, cardiovascular capacity, strength, all those things. Broadening the pelvis, stimulating breast development, increasing fat deposition also. And that fat deposition, of course, is, again, for the childbearing component, standpoint of having significant enough fat on the body from a health standpoint for longer capacity to be able to have energy for the ability to insulation, for protection, a lot of factors there from a standpoint of the need for fat, and that less need from a genetic standpoint, purely from genetic standpoint for need of having children for activity necessarily, even though obviously, if all things being equal, in many cases women can exceed men's capacity for performance, and depending on a lot of factors. We'll get back to that in a second. But that said, fat particularly is increased in the thighs and hips due to increased lipoprotein lipase activity. That's what's going on the deeper level as to why there's such a much greater fat deposition for women than men in those areas. Okay? And of course, with men, those gonadotropic hormones, the follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, stimulate the testes and testosterone in boys. And testosterone is present in women as well. There's some estrogen in men as well, much lesser so. But that said, testes or testosterone response increases bone formation. Okay, so they have greater bone formation, more size, and potentially more length too. And it's also the bone growth time frame, muscle growth time frame. Growth in general is slower, more broadened to longer periods. So there's actually a longer period of growth. We talked about before where women often tend to be coming up to maturity by between ages 12 to 15. Okay, and it's not always true, but on average 12 to 15, whereas men can be like 17 to 21. Much older for total maturation of hormone response, bone growth, muscle growth, not including training, right? Just natural response genetically, individually, okay? And that said, the increased protein synthesis because of testosterone helps lead to greater muscle mass and stimulates something called erythropoietin, EPO, which is produced by the kidneys, which increases red blood cell production and basically adds to hemoglobin, which has a high affinity for oxygen. So it also affects VO2 max, cardiovascular capacity. So men typically have a higher level of red blood cell production on average than women do. So consequently leads to higher VO2 max, higher endurance capacities from a standpoint of sport as well. That being said, strength differences, talking about women and men versus strength. What's interesting is that women typically have 40-60% weaker upper body strength than men and 25-30% weaker in lower body. Seems to be a lesser difference in lower body specifically for women. And that being said, it's relative to body weight, not just gender. Okay, the variance goes down to about 5 to 15%, generally speaking, for between, especially in athletes. Okay, we're talking about strength differences, so it can be as low as 5 to 15% in well-trained elite men versus elite women when it comes to strength. Okay, there still is, from a world record standpoint, maximal strength, broader differences than 15%. Okay, there's some of that is also speculated to be due to the differences in a number of women doing certain things like maximal strength loading versus men. So there's less competition, so there's less drive for performance gain. So there's some of that. How much is the difference there? We have to look at the test of time to see progression of time. How much time has there been that men have involved in a certain sport or activity versus women doing it? And the competitive aspect plays a role with developing maximal capacities, certainly, as well. And we've seen that gap close like in the 100-meter dash from a maximal standpoint, or throwing events in a very pure standpoint of maximal strength, maximal speed, men versus women. There's still a gap there, but it's a much smaller gap around, and that gets where we get that 10-15%, maybe as little as 5% in some circles. Okay, but that being said, that's due to a difference in bone length, bone density, mass, difference in body mass, as well as testosterone affecting muscle mass and red blood cell production for, not so much for the strength, I should say, of the red blood cells, but more specific to muscle mass, bone density, bone length, body mass, all playing a role there. That, however, no differences were found between genders when referred to strength per unit of muscle cross-sectional area. So assuming a woman can get the same amount of muscle mass and get more specifically the same amount of muscle cross-sectional area, there seems to be pretty much the same strength. Okay, so, but the thing is, on average, you would expect that women have a harder time doing that unless they had a higher level of naturally producing testosterone. Okay, that would be a big difference in why you might see that. Women have a greater resistance to fatigue, interestingly, relative to force production, typically more like holding like your maximal capacity to produce force in a static position, isometrically, right? Remember, eccentric is actually lowering a load. You're decelerating, you're slowing something down. Concentric is you're moving it. Isometric is you're holding it. You're stronger, not so much stronger, any of the three. It's harder to produce force to move something because you're essentially changing its direction. You're actually making it move the opposite direction it wants to go. So concentric is always the hardest. Isometric is a little bit less difficult, and the easiest is going to be the eccentric, because you're just trying to slow something down. You're letting it go where it wants to go, just slowing it down. Okay, that's a mechanical standpoint from a standpoint of force. That being said, when you're holding in place isometrically, I'm trying to hold that and stabilize something, women, typically speaking, can maintain the max capacity with their abilities at a higher level, at their level, their relative to their body weight, relative to their mass, for longer periods than men typically can. It's interesting, right? So it's relative to them. So they expect that maybe if you have two men, a man and a woman, both exact same weight, that you might expect doing like a plank or something like that, or pushing on a wall and exerting amount of force would have to be something to actually measure the force production there. That the women would be able to hold there, not necessarily have a higher level of force production. That's key there too. That's why the plank thing might not work out either. But that said, it has to be actual force production. They have to be measuring with EMGs, like the ability to actually maintain that same capacity for force output for longer periods. Women typically are much higher than men, up to 50% higher. Okay. That said, some of that is also speculated to do with the need for childbearing. It's a lot of stress, right? It's something I'll never understand from a fully standpoint. I never had to do it. We have one child, and of course, knowing that and how much we have to go through with that and seeing that happen, it's not surprising that there's requirement for the ability to be able to statically produce force for longer periods of time. All right. That said, cardiovascular and respiratory function differences. Women typically have a higher heart rate at the same level of work, typically due to lower stroke volumes than men, typically because they have smaller hearts, because they have smaller body masses, generally speaking. They also have lower plasma volume. Now, what can change that, of course, is a difference in activity. Those levels of difference will decrease because if women train regularly, just like anybody else, man or woman, train regularly cardiovascularly, they'll see increased stroke volumes over time. You'll see some growth of the left ventricular wall and as well as left ventricle size as a whole. See certainly greater dilation or a widening or opening of arteries, allowing more blood flow, which helps stroke volume, whatnot. Decreased arteriovenous oxygen difference, meaning you're getting better utilization of the oxygen. You don't have to expel as much relative to what you're taking in. Or I'm sorry, you actually can use more efficiently what you're taking in and have a greater capacity for it. All those things can and will change with training. How much it can narrow the gap is individual and hard to say for sure, which is always my favorite thing anyway. When someone says a man versus a woman, like, I want you to tell me which man versus which woman. That's what we want to talk about, because you're going to find situations where it defies the norms and things we talk about. These are just norms, expectations. And it also depends upon someone's levels of individual difference from their background. A great example, like in tennis, Serena Williams is still playing, right? Amazing. She's still playing at a high level. Difficult to do, skill wise, especially, is higher, let alone producing the same amount of force over a greater period of time. But from an athletic standpoint of maximal force production, speed, power, from an athletic standpoint, there's never been anyone like that on the tennis court for women like Serena Williams. Her capacity to be able to produce force, be powerful, quick, and all those things. And despite the fact she came back from having had a child and she'd gained 30, 40 pounds, and her first term back, she did very well. She didn't make it to the finals, but she moved all the way through the rounds because, one, she still has some of the skill, but she still has some of that power too. She didn't move as well, which is why I think ultimately she fatigued more, but such an athlete that she was able to keep going. And she's able to exceed her capacity skill-wise from the standpoint of there are other athletes all the way through that I think have had higher levels of skill tennis-wise than she has. But she has such an athletic standpoint, higher levels almost guaranteed of testosterone than anyone else on the women's tennis tour, consequently leading to greater capacities for force production, right? Then you have freakish results for men as well. When you see someone like Usain Bolt, his capacity to produce force, and I'm going to argue for him, not so much a muscle mass standpoint, from a neural standpoint. I would love to see some research, and I'm not going to be able to take him apart like an alien or something like that to be able to see what's going on with him. But I would love to be able to do that, see what's really going on deep tissue-wise, why it's so much different for him, right? Such a freak of nature for how fast that man can run or could run. Maybe still can. women tend to have 15-20% lower VO2 max on average, where women basically untrained tend to be around 38% VO2 max, where the trained women tend to be around 55% VO2 max, and then men 44% for untrained, up to about 71 for men. It's interesting to kind of see these numbers here. Like for me, knowing mine's right around close to 48 to 50 right now. It might be a little lower. I haven't tested in a couple months. Might have gone down closer to that 44. But that said, higher than 71. So I think it's interesting that I'm kind of revolving right around those two numbers. Between my trained times, a little higher than that for my trained VO2 max, and right about that for my untrained. Just interesting to note that. And so these numbers aren't exact, but they're pretty average. I mean, it's pretty consistent. You're looking about here that 38 to 44, about a 15% difference. Okay. And if we're looking at 55 to 71 in the trained version, you're looking at actually now you're looking at about a 30% difference there in trained. Actually, a much wider variance potential on average VO2 max wise. And of course, that's probably due to different hemoglobin content, red blood cells, where those red blood cells are produced by the kidneys. And again, that hemoglobin has a high affinity for oxygen. So if you have a greater level of red blood cell development, your ability to utilize oxygen, the capacity to produce force for longer periods, the capacity to have higher levels of VO2 max, lactate threshold, all those things are much higher levels with greater numbers of red blood cells, higher levels of hemoglobin. Some of that can be trained. And of course, the lower stroke volume for women due to their lower, due to differences in that red blood cell content and hemoglobin content plays a role with less skeletal muscle mass, as well with due to estrogen differences versus testosterone and the lower stroke volumes, meaning heart will work harder, cardiac output wise, but the stroke volume won't be coming up as much, generally speaking, from what we've seen. Doesn't mean they can't train it to be pretty darn close, though. Gains in strength or cardiovascular performance are relatively similar regardless of gender. So meaning if you start at 38, if you start at 44, your actual percentage gain is going to be relatively similar, okay, percentage-wise, okay. Special issues for women. Menstruation. Typical cycle is about 28 days, but it really can vary from 23 to 36 days. And of course, that can vary one person to another. That said, dysfunction can occur needing to alter training if we have someone have dysmenorrhea, whereby they have an altering of their cycle. They have amenorrhea, like cessation of the cycle, painful menstruation. That all those things can really be problematic, clearly. And in situations where if you're a coach or someone training women, especially if you're a man training women, to be honest, whenever someone brought up something like that, I always gave them a reprieve. And it's one of those things that you just don't want to take a chance with. I think as a coach, a high school coach, having coached female athletes at high school level and college level both, and having had someone come and tell me, if it's on a regular basis, I'd want to see a doctor's note, like what's going on. If they were being affected on a regular basis, there's something wrong. But if I had a bad day and something's going on, I said, fine, take the day. Okay, do what you need to do. I'm not going to question that for you. There's a lot of things that are different in women than in men in that regard. However, if something happens more regularly, I want some more medical support there to know what's really going on from a health standpoint, not just whether they're making it up or not, use it as an excuse. I never expect that. I'm always assuming there's actual rationale for it. Having a painful menstruation or disruption of cycles are things we want to be very cautious about, and seeking medical assistance on that is very, very wise. And certainly needing to alter training if that's the case. Certainly you need to have enough training, though, too. Too little training can affect the cycle as we age. Having less regular cycles without regular moderate to lower intensity exercise, not the high intensity. High intensity is not going to help the cycle here. In fact, high intensity could actually disrupt cycles if you're seeing too frequent usage of high intensity exercise. So many reasons why high intensity exercise shouldn't be sought more than a couple times a week for someone who's regularly doing it. Never more than 3 times. Even 3 times is questionable. Okay. Menarche, the first menstruation is often delayed in young athletes because of disruption in cycles, so have to be careful with that. It's not necessarily bad. It can be if it doesn't happen for much later. One of the best things I ever heard a female athlete say was a silver medalist long jumper or high jumper, I can't remember which, somewhere in one of the Eastern Bloc type countries back in the 90s. She was like 21 years old, and they were interviewing her about her training and what she was doing, and she was saying, I'm expecting not to do this very long, this level of training. The second best in the world, right? Silver medalist. I'm not going to do this much longer because I'm concerned about its ability to how much it's going to affect my hormonal balance, affect my overall development from the standpoint of being able to have children. And that's a very important, realistic perspective for an elite female athlete to be thinking about. It's very individual. That's why they need to be seeking medical support and help to see what's going on internally, not just assume that if you engage in elite level sport, you're going to have no capacity to have children. That's just not true. But certainly got to be paying attention to things because there's a lot more going on, a lot more complicated activity hormonally for women than men. And again, amenorrhea is the absence of menstruation affecting the cycle, whereby it's just not there. Missing a cycle often usually indicates missing a cycle potential for being pregnant. That being said, it's more from an athletic perspective, more due to something wrong with possibly too intensive training, too much stress in general. It's not just exercise, but we got to be careful of those kinds of things. And again, dysmenorrhea is a painful menstruation. For women who are pregnant, the greatest concerns really come in the second, third trimesters. The primary concern, the first trimester, don't add more to exercise. Don't do more than you were doing before. Don't attempt to get more fit. I've seen some people try to increase their activity knowing that they're going to gain weight with pregnancy, and that's concerning. We don't want that. Really perfect world, someone who's pregnant would have very close contact with their doctor, a doctor who understands them specifically, not seeing a doctor a doctor for the very first time when pregnant. Hopefully a doctor you use as a confidant, knows you, knows about you as a female before they talk about what you should and shouldn't do, because that's going to be very individual. No question about it. But we don't want someone to start something new or increase their level of activity during that first trimester. Second and third, probably can, and I've seen many people say, research-wise has been shown this for some people, as well as some doctors say that it's really individual, that you can just continue to do what you normally do. Just, again, don't add more. I tend to take more of a conservative approach from my research and what I've seen, that should back off a little bit. No reason to go to high intensity stuff now. This is lower and moderate intensity type stuff at the very, very most. And the moment you feel something not good, you don't feel good, you stop, which should happen anyway, by the way, right? But there are greater concerns with greater levels of flexibility going that second, third trimester, basically hormones being secreted that are actually creating greater mobility than we had before, greater flexibility. So there's a greater possibility of injury doing certain activities, getting rid of, or not getting rid of, but reducing balance challenging activities. Nothing is going to create a possibility of falling, right? Intense activities where there's a possibility of injury or damage to the fetus, damage to the child, which really needs to be the predominant focus for basically for a female. They're having a child, right? And I know it's got to be hard. I can only imagine. I'll never know that there's so much going on with a woman's body going into their second, third trimester as things getting more and more challenging. Sometimes the want to exercise, particularly for a regular exerciser, may grow, but at the same time, they have to take into account the most important thing at this time. Osteoporosis, poor diet certainly plays a role. Lack of a proper mineral content, lack of proper foods that are going to assist with bone growth, vitamin mineral content in general. And I mentioned it before. I don't understand how anybody would not do a vitamin mineral supplement. To be really clear, I've known countless numbers of women who have had issues with, in later years, having children, basically seeking help from a physician, and the physician, guess what? Surprisingly, not surprisingly, administering or expecting them to take a vitamin mineral supplement. And you know what often happens? That helps regulate the cycle, hormonal balance, vitamin mineral content vitamins aiding cofactors with food and food responses, minerals aiding basically function of the vitamins, and this synthetic is basically this whole synthesis of all these functions coming together. And again, that's why I'm a huge proponent, and I will never back off that from anything I've seen, unless I see some great research that says not so much like it's not showing it's fully necessary, but says it's bad. Well, then it's bad. I'm not doing it. Okay. That being said, I've seen numerous pieces of research talk about how the benefit could be there. That's true of a lot of supplements, right? But that said, vitamin mineral is huge. And of course, the primary thing from a standpoint of maintaining bone porosity, bone density, not getting significant bone porosity and losing bone density and hopefully bone growth over time, is compressive force activity. The weight-bearing activity from a standpoint of compressive forces with pressing type activities relative to the ground specifically. The pool will do nothing for compressive force activity. Really important to understand that, because the water differences there affecting the buoyancy, affecting resistance to pull from gravity is greatly varied with water. So consequently, skill-wise, from a performance standpoint, water is not going to help someone on land very well, if at all. You don't see people who are swimmers and water polo players, certainly maybe from a throwing perspective, a little bit like a good arm action there, but when they're not used to putting their feet on the ground to throw, they're trying to stay afloat when they're doing it, so they have a very different action, different compressive forces. It's not going to be the same thing at all. I try to throw a ball on land, not going to be the same thing at all. Somewhat, skills there, from the arm perspective, but not so much from the same body from pressing compressive forces off the ground. So that is important from the standpoint of bone density growth as well as skill development too. We can really argue that as well. Eating disorders, anorexia and bulimia. Anorexia is basically the idea that someone is actually eating so little, they're losing body mass, and they actually tend to exhibit high degrees of concern over what we call body dysmorphia, basically feeling like they're fat, feeling like I'm overweight, I got to do something about this, and going to extremes of significant exercise way beyond what's advised, intensity-wise, duration-wise, and eating very little, which doesn't take a rocket scientist for us to figure out that's not a good combination. And you'll usually see that. It's pretty easy to see. It's one of those things that is really a head turner from the standpoint of you trying to see what you turn to look and say, did I see what I just thought I saw? There's like no body mass there at all. Can that person even walk? How do they walk? I've seen that's always been a concerning thing when I see something like that. And that's one of those things that if they're under 18, same with bulimia, but we'll get there in a second. With under 18, make sure you talk to their parents. The parents will deal with it. If they're 18 years or older, they're an adult, well, then you need to talk to them and also bring in the help of probably more than one professional. Most likely, probably a medical doctor, probably a psychologist or psychiatrist, okay, as well as a dietitian talking about diet. Kind of invoke the help of all three. Okay, that's probably a very, very vital thing to do. And in situations where someone's been in a gym and suspecting, you can't really tell bulimia, because bulimia is basically purging, eating food, then going and purging. So you can actually eat something and get the sensation of like, I get to eat, and I feel the pleasure from eating, but then at the same time, I don't want to gain the weight, so I'm going to go throw it up. And of course, that can create some major issues health-wise, throat cancer down the road, and effectively eroding the airway, the air passages, because basically, you have bile coming up through basically the trachea and through the throat coming into the mouth. And there's nothing good from that at all. Major health issues can be resulting from that long term, let alone the issues of not getting nutrients. Both of them are going to be lacking nutrients, right? With differences in body masses to some extent, with greater loss of body mass with anorexia. But certainly it could be both. It could be bulimic and anorexic, okay? Either way, seek help for them, get them help. Don't let them exercise more, or if at all, if these issues are present, because greater health concerns are in place. Okay. Environmental factors, hot, cold, and altitude. When it's really hot, basically with less body mass is going to be helping deal with heat, right? You don't want to have a larger body mass. You're actually going to appreciate from the standpoint of having less mass. When it's hotter, I'll be able to tolerate it. When it's cold, is the opposite. So you're going to see differences in sometimes women having more of a feeling cold than men do from the standpoint of body mass differences, with men being larger body mass. Not always true. You see differences there. So that must do to metabolic rate, right? But typically speaking, men tend to have a higher metabolic rate, so you see that as well. And of course, with aging, you have differences in the ability for the skins, basically at the cutaneous level, the skin layer there. Basically, you have less capacity for constriction and helping keep the body warm, so heat is lost. And you see how people who are older, men or women more than men, experience stress at cold and having issues there. Altitude, certainly with higher VO2 max, higher red blood cell content, so higher hemoglobin content, so better oxygen utilization. All that's going to be a greater role with capacity for handling altitude-related stress. So having either greater conditioning or, from a general standpoint, having higher red blood cells and hemoglobin content is going to play a role there. That's it. Final thoughts. I would say for sure with your paper, I would finalize your title this week for your paper. I want my paper title to be on this. A lot of you have been emailing me, what do you think of this title? That's great. I appreciate that. You don't have to do this, but I highly recommend it, because you don't want to have a broad enough title that, again, so broad, you're going to lose a lot of points on your paper because there's just too much content you could have been writing on, and your paper seems very incomplete because it's too broad. You also don't want to be so narrow you don't have to write on. That's not good. But I'm not going to grade that. I don't need to see that, but I really kind of expect you're getting that. And then consider forming your abstract if you can this week. That first paragraph describing what you're going to really try to do with your paper, and then gathering and taking most of your notes from at least 3+ peer-reviewed research articles. That's what you have to have, at least 3 articles, preferably more, but at least 3. In addition to information we covered in our text in our class, you can cite the textbook, of course, but it better be at least 3 peer-reviewed research articles. Make sure they're in APA format. And I understand the challenges of having an APA format. I actually had one student in my advanced XPhys class saying, it's really hard because I've taken this like when I cite my research and I go put it into Mendeley, or I put it on different sites, it gives me a slight variation in how it's reported. All right. And it's like, there's a lot of variation there. And because APA format is the goal we're aiming for here, we're trying to keep us consistent with that. I have asked you to go back and actually change anything you cited and put it in APA format. And one of the biggest things being with the italicizing of your journal title, as well as italicizing the volume number before you put in parentheses right next to it the issue number. A lot of people aren't doing that, and it's not because it's your fault, because you're citing off someplace else, but we're trying to keep it all in APA format. It's like so many things in life. First of all, aggravating because you see so many different ways of doing it, and they're not wrong. They're just not the way we're trying to keep it consistent to APA format, trying to keep it in the same way. And I will not let's be really clear, you're not going to get a lower grade in the class because you didn't cite an APA format perfectly. Now, you're going to lose points from the standpoint of if you don't even do it at all. But if I go back at the end of this semester and you have an 88 in the class, and you've been doing extremely well as an example, or 78, or whatever it is, whenever you're borderline for one grade versus another, within a couple percentage points, I go back there and I look at, you lost a point because you had some slight variation, you didn't put something in parentheses, you're not going to get a lower grade in this class based on that. Please don't over stress about this. Go back in and change it, make it in APA format 7, related to the OWL Purdue site. It's the best way to go to get it very consistent there. It tells you exactly how to do it, and that's the site we actually use as our primary basically cite for our citations to see it. I know other professors have told you to put in other places, and in which case I respect that, but I want to make sure it is an APA format 7. Okay, that's vital for what we're doing here, and that's just that simple. Okay, it's like so many things. It's just that's the way we're doing it here. That said, this week, 4.6 to 4.12, get your abstract, get your 3 research articles, take your notes, and that your first draft, get it done by 4.19. So you got 2 weeks, okay, to get a draft. Enough. You're going to be sending the draft to me, okay, and we're going to get that draft to at least one other student, and they're going to peer review it, and I'm going to give you some guidelines of what I want you to be reviewing, and actually nitpicking it, tearing it apart. I want you to tear it apart, so much so that when I get it, there's nothing for me to tear apart, and I have a hard time not giving A's and B's on your papers. That's the goal. Hopefully a lot of A's. So tear your friends or your classmates' papers apart when you get this, and so that you know that, hey, they've found everything so much here that I can do real well with my paper now. That's the expectation, okay? Peer reviews I found to be tremendously valuable for helping get you ready for your final, not just from the standpoint of actual research, which is what you have to do too, but more standpoint of your papers in general. Your demo post number 13 is up shortly, going to be up shortly. It's not up yet, but will be up very shortly here. Maybe by the time you actually see this, probably will be up. Okay, and it will be due by Thursday. I'm going to give you a little more time again, not like Wednesday, to get it done this week. And of course, your post's been fantastic so far this last couple of weeks, unbelievably great. Please keep that up. Okay, that's going to be doing a very, very high service to you to increasing your grade. You're basically looking at, honestly, from what you're seeing in your grade, if you look at Blackboard right now, you're probably seeing up to, if you ace the back end of the class here, probably seeing a variation of about 10% of that grade. Okay, up to 10%. You have to ace the back end of the class here, though, this last month. If you aced it, you can see up to like 8 to 10% improvement on your score. Okay. Maybe if your lowest score is low enough, you might see more than that. But that's kind of what you're looking at. If you're like a B- right now, you got an outside shot at an A-. You have to really crush it, though, this last 4 weeks, okay? If you got a B, you get an absolute shot at A-. Moving like 2 levels is probably not a big deal this last 4 weeks. 3 levels is going to be tougher for many of you, so keep that in mind. Not impossible. Email me. I'll help you along the way. I want you to get the grade you want, the grade you deserve. We have to have both the one you want and the one you deserve, okay? I think a lot of you have kind of come to a little more of a state of being relaxed here, which is good. You should. Getting used to it now after 2.5 weeks in. A few of you expressed stress and concerns. You need to email me if you have those concerns. I can't help you if I don't know you're having those concerns. I've heard kind of on the back end with some of you, some of the stresses you're feeling, and I don't even know about it. I can't help you if that's the case. That's my job. That's what I'm supposed to be doing here. I feel very useless, and it stresses me out and depresses me, frankly. It really bothers me if I can't help you. You got to give me that chance to do it so I can do my job and you can do yours really, really well. That is our goal, isn't it? Get the most out of what we're doing. Okay. That being said, One just, but thanks. That's an old post right there. We don't need that. I forgot to take it off, but Thanksgiving. That'd be nice, wouldn't it? That being said, I will give you another lecture video coming up here shortly. Probably a little couple more thoughts maybe about gender differences, but moving on more into the next chapter for Wednesday's class at some point on Wednesday, either really late Wednesday or hopefully by Tuesday night is my goal for your next video. Okay, lecture video. Take care. Please take good care of yourselves. Please, again, keep respecting the social distancing concept. It's really hard now. We're being into our 4th week of doing this kind of stuff, whereby you're trying to keep away from your friends. I know you want to go see your friends, whatnot. Really doing our best to keep this at a minimum. I really feel like a real sense of social responsibility to not further the progress of what's going on. I don't feel like I'm going to get sick. I really don't. I feel like I get exposed to it. I'm pretty healthy, or I might get some symptoms, but I don't think it's going to be bothering me much. But that's not the issue for me. It's like I pass it on to somebody else, and that's what I don't want to do. So avoid public areas where you're with a lot of people. Maintain social distancing. Take good care of yourselves, and be well. And please email me or call me with concerns you have. I'll do everything I can. If I can't help you, I'll find someone else who can. Take care. Be good. Talk to you again soon.